Welcome back to Atlantic Fellows Conversations from the Climate Action Convening in Bogotá, Colombia. I'm Fionnuala Sweeney. In this podcast, we hear from Atlantic Fellow Busiswe Dlamini from South Africa about the challenges of bringing about systems change without reproducing the inequities of the past and how climate action is central to working for equity for all.
I'm Busiswe Dlamini, based in Johannesburg in South Africa, and we are currently in Bogotá in Colombia, in a beautiful setting at the moment, an office building, but that has an upstairs terrace with lush colors, and it's green and beautiful. I'm part of the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity, and I was part of the 2019 cohort. So even though that does feel like a lifetime ago, there is a part of it that feels like the threads of what started in that journey are still so present in my involvement with the Atlantic Institute. I think we had a great fellowship cohort, both in terms of people that were doing just incredibly diverse and just really powerful work that I know I was inspired by, and part of what still fuels me to want to get involved, to sharpen my own tools in terms of what I think of social change and advocating for issues of justice. In our cohort, actually, we've remained pretty tight. I'd consider them family. It's people I would call at 3 a.m. if I had a crisis, yeah. So the fellowship has meant that to me. And I think part of my own interest in remaining connected is how do we amplify that in other ways? So understanding if we are wanting to effect change, it requires strong relationships that are resilient in times of hardship, and thinking what's shifted from 2019 to present. I think in a world that's gone through quite major changes, these relationships are what's going to sustain us as individuals in order to be able to effect the change we want to see. So my work for a while was around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, initially predominantly in a South African context. I have a background in systems thinking and scenario planning. For a long time, I feel like when using some of those tools that are about thinking about big systems, without understanding the power that plays out in terms of some of the identities that are part of those systems, I feel like we are often reproducing some of the inequities. So if a huge part of systems thinking is trying to leverage some of the existing power nodes, it can sometimes be unintentionally reproducing the same power nodes. So if you're saying you are designing a process that wants to involve the main players in any system, a food system, the health system, the existing players at the moment are still based on the inequities of the past in terms of South Africa. Often I'd find myself in rooms where it would still be predominantly white, senior people that are incredibly experienced, but not always aware how the majority of society in a South African context might be excluded from some of those conversations or making those decisions. So I think part of my own interest in understanding how power operates from a basis of what I'd call critical diversity is both what's the awareness that's required, but what's also the ability to be able to design processes that are intentionally trying to disrupt those power nodes in the first place. To effect change, as much as people in South Africa, for instance, will say, it's been 30 years since democracy, how are we still here? And there's a part of me that completely agrees with the frustration of how slow things have been. But when I'm also on the other side of trying to effect change in institutions, in society, I also know how challenging it can be for various reasons. But when there are examples of things changing, I do think it requires the kind of servant leadership that I don't think always exists in organizations. One of the projects with Wits University, so in Johannesburg, which is the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. So I was part of a team that was rolling out a process with an institution called the National Research Foundation, a funding body, essentially, that funds higher education in South Africa. One of the things that would become clear is we could offer all the training and all the frameworks in terms of what is needed. But unless there's a leader internally who's committed to effect that change, it often feels like you hit a cul-de-sac. I want to share one example. One of the institutions was based in the Eastern Cape in South Africa and funding more water science research. When we first started, one of the questions was around how do you support emerging Black scientists? What if the field itself is not attracting the right people? So just the usual things around what the barriers are. And if I tell you some of the small changes that were able to catalyze the change that was required, I'll offer 2 examples. So one of the things that happens in societies like South Africa, often Black communities might not be attracted to water sciences because people don't swim in some cases in city-based situations. So the requirement to be able to swim is often a barrier. And then the institution decided, rather than that being the barrier, to say if people are wanting to apply, they're wanting to offer swimming as support. It seems so small, and that's the thing about some of the change we're talking about. What's the willingness to co-create those solutions? How are we in conversations that are generative, conversations that can really identify some of the nodes of change that might support what we're wanting to work towards? So just that small action, rather than saying, if you don't swim, you can't come, to say, actually, if you want to apply, we want to support you in terms of ensuring that you can swim. Just shifting something really small. Then the second part was once students are on the program, one of the limitations was around how they're able to get around to do research. And one of those things would be being able to drive, to go to the field. Again, if you understand the limitations in terms of resources, if I come from a family where no one else was driving, I'm also less likely. Suddenly, then the institution was wanting to support students in terms of ensuring that you can do field work. So those are the kinds of things. And of course, I'm not saying all systems can be changed by small actions, but I'm saying if there's the goodwill, that's already half the battle won. I think Atlantic's always had an element of climate as part of the conversations of what we think justice to be. If all the programs are working towards equity, actually climate has always been central to that. In the past few years, more voices have been emerging around how can we support a pillar that is more integrated around climate rather than climate being infused, in some cases peripherally and in some cases maybe more pronounced. So in this convening, a group of fellows came together that had been having this conversation. Some of us were not part of the initial conversation around this gathering, but as we were hearing the ideas that were emerging, it became clear that we both want to support that, but also that our work would benefit from this. So the thing for me that's been really exciting about this is I think as much as Atlantic can lead in terms of what's needed, this is a community of incredible change makers in the world. So suddenly when the fellows themselves have agency in terms of determining some of the things, and of course supported by Atlantic, for me it feels like it's really moving us to the next level of what might be required to be able to sustain the work that's been put into this fellowship. In my case, I'd heard that a group was emerging around issues of climate. I'm new in the climate space. So in the last 3 years, there's been more of a drive to introduce what's called JEDI, so Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. If my previous work was focusing on the diversity, equity, and inclusion, the climate space is saying actually we're needing to have a broader integration of what we understand as justice that then includes things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'd initially been invited by a few South African organizations to support them in their justice, equity, and diversity and inclusion work. But through those conversations, it became clear if we're talking about equity in all senses, these are not parallel conversations. What's the work of trying to integrate them more intentionally? So that's been my curiosity for the past 3 years. And the Atlantic space has been both a place of learning, but also the place where I can share my observation, my insights. Initially, my climate work was only in a South African context. But a lot of the South African organizations I was working with had worked regionally on the African continent and in some cases internationally. So I'm now straddling multiple geographies in some of this work, and in some cases moving beyond just what would be justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion to issues of organizational culture, to issues of leadership in organizations. So there's a broader scope in terms of what else is needed in terms of building capacity for organizations to be able to do this work in a way that's robust, in a way that's mindful of the power differences that still exist in the world. We can have good intentions, but unless we are able to navigate some of the fault lines that continue to trip us, sometimes we also still reproduce the damage that we're trying to undo, even with our work. So that's been my excitement in coming into the space. I feel I'm probably one of the least experienced in terms of climate, but I'm hoping, and that was part of my request as I was coming in, that hopefully as I learn more about climate, my own insights now working within different spaces can also be of benefit to this community. I come both with a sense of curiosity into this work and I think also a sense of humility that I haven't felt in a long time. There's something about having worked maybe for 10 years in another space where I hold a lot of expertise to suddenly be listening in a different way, holding different questions, I think is a skill or a capacity I'm wanting to lean into at the moment. I think the thing to understand about climate is we might all be experiencing the climate crisis throughout the world. But how it's impacting us might be different because of where we're located. So both in terms of the present, but also if you understand the historical inequities. And by that I'll mean, am I living in a country that already has the kind of infrastructure, the emergency responses that support me being able to be taken care of when there is a crisis? Versus I am in a region that already was disadvantaged economically, so that would then have a knock-on effect in terms of what does that mean in terms of infrastructure. And then there might be other things in terms of if you think of those inequities not playing just geographically, but also who's impacted, women being more impacted, someone with a disability, how are they impacted? Those are some of the things that we're wanting to consider. So in a community like this, where the Atlantic Fellows come literally from all around the world, hopefully parts of these conversations are saying we all bring a different piece to the puzzle. So first of all, in just understanding what the context of each fellow is, they bring a world with them, essentially. And I want to use this analogy of the puzzle. Through trying to stitch those together, hopefully we're saying in our responses, are those responses trying to create more equity? I can say the solution is just to have more green energy, but the reality is who has the technology to be able to provide that? Which countries are more able to finance certain programs versus others? That's an equity question. So even in our solutions, to be constantly thinking to ourselves, who's included in the solution, who's excluded, and how could we come up with solutions that are constantly trying to address this question of making space for everybody, but also that the barriers are eliminated for all that we're trying to work with or include in our solutions. So the opportunity actually with climate is starting to show us that the spaces that we had always thought either disadvantaged or are needing to be fixed are where the solution's going to come from. So the example I'd like to share is of a community in Colombian in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, a community that has waged a just Herculean resistance in terms of issues of climate, both in terms of drawing from indigenous knowledge, in terms of their understanding. In this case, the work that they're doing is preservation of the environment that's also linked to the ocean. So drawing from indigenous knowledge around what this means for them. They've been able to bring in other people or lean into expertise of lawyers in order to be able to advocate for both their own rights, but setting a precedence in terms of some of the court cases that they've been able to wage. Actually, some of that has been of benefit not just to their own community. That's having a ripple effect throughout the country, on the rest of the continent, and sometimes in international gatherings. So there's something about climate that really is calling us to say whose voices were often marginalized. What do those people have to say that might offer the solution that's needed? That's been a powerful experience, and that might be the shift that's required.
That brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you for listening. Next time we hear from Atlantic Fellow Johnny Miller from the US about his photography project, Unequal Scenes, on inequality in big cities around the world. I'm Fionnuala Sweeney, and you've been listening to Atlantic Fellows Conversations from the Climate Action Convening in Colombia. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on and subscribe to the series wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Atlantic Fellows and their work for equity, please go to our website at www.atlanticfellows.org.